Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, March 1959. Let's head to the eastern shore of Virginia near the Potomac River and Chesapeake Bay. Folks familiar with this area will know it as Delmarva, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia. Beaches and crabs and fishing. And on this day, the Potomac River Fisheries Commissioner H.C. Byrd ordered that the fisheries police be disarmed after an officer got into a skirmish and killed a Virginia waterman who was illegally dredging. Now, I know this sounds very obscure, a policy change at the Potomac River Fisheries Department, but this policy change is in some ways credited with reducing the temperature and largely bringing an end to what were known as the Oyster Wars. And the Oyster Wars are super interesting and super long. They were conflicts among fishermen and authorities and scientists and locals dating all the way back into the mid-1800s. So we're going to talk about this incident, but the Oyster Wars in general. And here, as always, are Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And we're very lucky to be joined by a special guest on this episode, Christine Keiner, chair of the Department of Science, Technology, and Society at the Rochester Institute of Technology. She's also the author of the book, The Oyster Question, Scientist Watermen and the Maryland Chesapeake Bay since 1880. Dr. Keiner, thanks for coming on the show. We're really glad to have you to talk about this.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for inviting me.
So what did I get wrong in the intro? Was it weird to tag it to 1959? I mean, does this little skirmish in 1959 really connect back to this larger war that goes all the way back into the 1800s?
Definitely. Of course, the mid-20th century, by that time, there was this sense that the Chesapeake watermen, the oystermen, men who gained their livelihoods by extracting these organisms from the bay were on their way out, that they were completely inefficient, and there was no reason in a high-tech modern society they would still be around. And this event really put a shocking spotlight not only on the violence of the extraction of natural resources, but reminding people that this was very common in previous decades, that a few people were still had living memories of it, but it was much more prevalent in the 1870s and 80s. There were tons of newspaper articles in the cities bordering the Chesapeake Bay about the oyster pirates. There was national attention, and this violence really reflected the social turmoil and the labor unrest that had been wrought by industrialization in the broader society of the Gilded Age. There were these more artisanal, traditional oystermen known as tongers, who used these very old-fashioned implements called tongs, developed from indigenous technologies around 1700. It's basically two rakes that face each other, kind of like scissors. You have to have a lot of strength to feel around the bottom of the bay to pull up a lick of oysters, it was called. And then these Gilded Age capitalists basically started bankrolling dredging boats. So the dredge was much more efficient. It's like a metal frame with a mesh cage behind it, and then the boat pulls it. It drags along the bottom of the bay, and it basically rips the oysters off the bed. Yeah. So the dredging fleets, they were like the equivalent of combine harvesters, and the dredgers would poach at night on the tonging grounds, and tongers would retaliate then by setting up their own cannons on shore. And
it's got violent fast.
I love the idea that there was this kind of artisanal craft way of harvesting oysters, and that it seems like particularly in Maryland there was a kind of protectionist set of policies to allow these kind of old school oyster farmers to be able to continue to practice their craft, and then this separate space for the dredgers. Unsurprisingly, in an industrializing capitalist system, you start to get this much more destructive form kind of moving in and displacing the artisans. But the idea that this turns into kind of a sea battle of sorts with pirates and cannons and all those sorts of things, I think makes it feel if not unique, just a particularly unusual expression of some of these labor fights.
Definitely. I mean, there were horribly violent, labor strikes going on in places like coal mines on the land, but this idea that there was a modern form of piracy occurring, like, really got a lot of attention in the press. Like, there's famous images that Harper's Weekly magazine printed. And usually it was only after like battles that then bad press stimulated the legislatures to realize we got to do something. We got to impose law and order. The Maryland one was one of the very first police forces in the whole U.S. that was intended to protect natural resources.
That's so interesting.
I don't think I realized just how massive this industry is, that like by the Civil War, almost half of the world's supply of oysters is coming from the Chesapeake. Like, that's just mind-blowing to me that they are producing like 4 million bushels of canned oysters annually. I mean, I love a good oyster, but I did not realize just like how big and lucrative this industry is. And I think that maybe you can address this as well, like how much of the violence stems from the amount of money that can be made from this industry.
Definitely. It was a post-Civil War development that Maryland allowed dredging. They had prohibited it before that time to try to protect the tongers, but there were all these New England oyster packers, sending dredge boats down to the Chesapeake area because they had fished out most of their oyster grounds. But the quantity of oysters being taken out really was amazing. This statistic I love is that from Chrisfield, Maryland, on the Eastern Shore, every morning, 20 to 30 railroad cars full of oysters were leaving.
Wait, what? 20 to 30 cars?
Yeah, and
That's
what
incredible.
in the world?
Is that because of changing taste, or is that because people finally got to a technological place where they could harvest at a new level? I mean, what was driving that? Was it replacing some other industry?
The technological developments are definitely a part of the story. There was the rise of steam canning, the railroad expansion, the development of steamboats, and then the post-war economy and the demand for cheap protein. So all these things converged to make Chesapeake oystering incredibly profitable, but also, attracting a lot of ruthless capitalists.
And well, it seems like environmental changes are playing a big role as well. You mentioned the kind of over harvesting that had happened in New England. If I recall, and correct me on this if I'm wrong, New York had also so polluted its waters that they had destroyed the oyster beds in the city, which would have also driven more demand down to places like the Chesapeake.
Definitely the overharvesting, and then also just huge amounts of raw sewage entering these bodies of water were increasingly making it dangerous to eat oysters. In the early 1890s, there were typhoid epidemics. A bunch of students from Yale wound up dying after having a fraternity oyster roast in 1892 or 3. But the Chesapeake had this reputation for much cleaner waters. They didn't have cities the size of like New York City.
Right.
At the same time, there was, pollution and raw sewage entering the Chesapeake. And then in the early 20th century, that's when cities like Baltimore realized, like, we need to start instituting state-of-the-art sewage treatment technology to not destroy the oyster industry.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting the world together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
I want to come back to the wars a little bit and get some more details there. But, we've mentioned a few times the word pirates. And when you read about this, you kind of get the sense that both sides thought the other side were the pirates, right? I mean, if you just really think of like illegal, unscrupulous activity by boat, both sides could be accused of that. But who were the pirates, and how much was it kind of like a little guy versus big guy battle as it raged on?
There were the two classes of oystermen fighting each other, the tongers versus the dredgers. But then there were also like Marylanders poaching on the Virginia side of the Chesapeake Bay and vice versa. And then often both of the classes of oystermen would unify against the police forces of either side. And tongers tended to own their own small boats, whereas dredge crewmen would work on a boat owned by often a wealthy packer. The oyster packing and canning firms often owned a lot of boats that they would lease out to captains. So that was a really much more degrading, dehumanizing job. It was so hard to find local people who were willing to serve on dredge boats that they often had shipping agents in places like New York City, and they would offer these lucrative contracts to immigrants right off the boat. And unfortunately, a lot of these guys got into these horrible situations where they'd be stuck for months out on the Chesapeake, getting very little money, very little food. The Maryland German Society played a big role in demanding that better treatment of the dredge crewmen occur. And then it wasn't until, again, a technological development around 1907, the gas-powered windlass meant that you didn't have to hire so many men to crank the ropes to bring the dredges in. And there was also a federal anti-Shanghaiing law. But yeah, otherwise it was an incredibly dehumanizing, dangerous trade to work in.
And with those technological developments in the early 20th century, does that de-escalate some of the violence, or is it still a pretty regular feature of oystering in the Chesapeake?
Definitely bringing in like the gas-powered windlass, reduce the need for labor, more professionalization of the fisheries forces helped. But even into the late 1950s with the shooting on the Potomac River, there was a lot of bad press showing that most of the men working for the Oyster Navy were political hacks, political appointees, who needed much better training in community relations, like some similar themes today when we see that police are not necessarily that well trained, and they really need to be in order to de-escalate situations with the communities with whom they're working.
So as we start to wrap up, I do want to talk a little bit about some of the echoes today. But one other story from the 1880s I think we need to hear from you is about the Dancing Molly. So tell us about the Dancing Molly. And, you talked about some of you kept saying over and over, all the men who worked on these ships and the men involved in this. But, the Dancing Molly is a really fascinating exception, right?
Yeah, so there are some water women throughout history. In fact, today I follow a Facebook page which is dedicated to water women who earn their livelihood that way. So the Dancing Molly was a ship, or rather a dredge boat in the Potomac River. So the Potomac River is kind of an unusual case because both Maryland and Virginia claimed sovereignty over it, and there were disputes over who had sovereignty that went all the way up until the era of John F. Kennedy, who signed off on a law and the development of a federal, like bi-state river commission. But this was a boat that was in a place where it was illegally dredging at night, and the governor of Virginia was trying to increase his political standing by showing he was a law and order guy, going after these illegal dredgers, and wound up being quite surprised coming upon this boat. The men were on shore, I think getting firewood, and they didn't realize that the captain's wife and 2 daughters were there, and they did an amazing job evading the governor, making him look like a fool.
I mean, it was a sailboat outrunning government steamers, right? Basically, and it caught a lot of attention. Right?
Oh, the governor had brought some reporters with him, thinking it was going to be a really successful night, and
wow.
I love a good.
You got beat by a girl. It's like, wow.
Love a good story about hubris.
Yeah.
I know, right?
So, Christine, as we wrap up, I mean, I'm curious if you see stories, well, what the echoes of this are now for the dredging community in the Chesapeake Bay, but just in general, if you see stories similar to this elsewhere. I mean, if you think about just kind of the pressures that are being put on the oceans from climate change and pollution and overfishing and so forth, are there other industries or other areas where you're starting to see this kind of economic stress and pressure result in these sort of tensions?
I mean, definitely the oceans have experienced decades and decades of overfishing, and scientists have sometimes been implicit in that in terms of developing quotas that seem to be sustainable but weren't really. And I don't want to give the impression that all fishermen are always over harvesting. A few bad apples, of course, give a bad name to everyone. Most fishermen, want there to be fair, consistently applied rules to ensure that no one is getting more than their fair share. And today, of course, we have surveillance systems that make it much easier to monitor these huge areas of the bay and the ocean. So you don't have to have, heavily armed ships all over the place. But yeah, definitely, it's up to everyone, including consumers, to ensure that we're eating seafood that has been provided by sustainable producers.
Well, I mean, out of curiosity, I don't know if you have an opinion on that, but does that actually have an impact, consumer choices in that regard?
Yes. Individuals do have a role to play as consumers and as voters as well. It's something I'm always emphasizing to my students.
This has been big, I know, with the whaling industry, particularly in Japan, that the desire for consumption of whale meat continues to drive that market, which has also led to quite a lot of on-the-water violence.
I can't believe I didn't ask this, but I guess I'll ask it at the end. But do you all like oysters? I know it's controversial.
Love them.
Oh, you love
them?
Do.
Me too. Christine, did you come into this out of your love of oysters?
Yes, and that's another way in which individuals can help by asking your restaurant, what do you do with the shucked shells? Unfortunately, many places throw them away, but around the Chesapeake, there are now programs in place for collecting them, because returning the shells to the oyster beds serves as a substrate for the baby oysters that would otherwise just get buried in the mud.
I know they're also planting oysters back in New York now in order to both help keep the water clean, but also because the water has cleaned up so much to maybe start to restart the industry there some.
So I'm pals with the folks who run the Billion Oyster Project.
Oh,
and
good.
I've seen that grow, and it's great. They're not quite eating them just yet, but we're getting there. We're getting there. Yeah,
baby steps.
Yeah,
it's
baby
it's
oysters.
a very cool project. Yeah,
That's one of the most fascinating shifts that I'm interested in. That the change from thinking of oysters as purely an economic resource to an ecological resource, because they do help filter the water.
Totally.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah. All right. Well, this has been very, very fascinating. I'm Christine Keiner of RIT. The book is The Oyster Question, Scientists, Watermen, and the Maryland Chesapeake Bay Since 1880. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been great.
Thank you. You're very welcome.
And Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.
From